Hey, welcome back everybody. We're going to be looking at the red cards in Oath of the Gatewatch this time. Red's usually not a color I get too excited about because it's usually straightforward. Sometimes it's deep enough to do a bunch of different things with, and it's certainly pretty good in Battle for Zendikar, so we'll see what we have here. Thanks for watching again, and I hope you guys are at least enjoying the reviews that I'm putting forth, whether you agree or disagree with the cards, or at least my evaluations of them. So let's see what we're starting with, and I'll be honest, we're starting with a card that I'm not a big fan of right now. This is Flame Seeker. It's a 3-mana 3/2, so on the vanilla test it's fine. It's equivalent to like a Goblin Rough Rider if you're not using the ability. What it does is cohort, meaning if you haven't watched the other videos or you're not familiar with the mechanic yet, it means you have to tap this guy in addition to another ally you control. So you're basically tapping two creatures. And you discard a card and draw a card. I am just flat out not impressed with cohort at all. This does not seem good. Tap two cards to loot, and it's not even a good loot. The good loot being draw, then discard. This is discard, then draw, so you could end up with something worse than what you discarded. Obviously, you're only going to use this ability to discard like extra lands and hopefully draw something better, but two creatures to do that, I'm not impressed. I guess the saving grace of cohort here is that at least it's tacked on to creatures that are playable without the ability, as a 3-mana 3/2 is just fine. We saw a bunch of those in Battle for Zendikar and other formats, and they usually make the cut. But if you just have a full 3 slot and you're not all in on allies or you have no reason to be looting, then I see this card being cut in favor of a more versatile, more useful 3-drop, which there are quite a few of in Battle for Zendikar. So again, not impressed with cohort, especially this one. Seems like one of the worst ones, but at least the card is playable on the vanilla test. Next we have a combat trick. This is Brute Strength. It's 2-mana instant. Target creature gets +3/+1 and gains trample. Now we see this sort of effect all the time. Tread Upon was just in Dragons of Tarkir not too long ago, where it filled the role of kind of pushing in your creatures. Green-red was a staple kind of archetype for that format, and the creatures sometimes had trouble getting through, so cards like Tread Upon let you push through, while also that trample was very important in the format. I don't know how important trample is going to be in this format, but if decks are super aggressive, then Brute Strength can be quite good. It's also fairly reasonably costed. It's not quite as efficient as something like Titan Strength, but you're trading off the Scry on Titan Strength for a Trample here, and Trample is fairly relevant when you're trying to push in damage. Now, Sure Strike is in Battle for Zendikar, which is the same mana cost for an instant that gives +3/+0 on first strike. Now, I like Sure Strike a little bit more because it not guarantees, but it makes it much more likely that your creature's going to survive, whereas the 1 toughness on Brute Strength means your creature's probably still going to die, but you're going to push in damage with Trample. So the trade-off's up to you. I'm sure, no pun intended, that you can get a Sure Strike in Battle for Zendikar. They're common and they go around pretty late. So if you want that sort of effect, you might just be able to wait until the Battle for Zendikar pack comes around, but if you really need it, then Brute Strength is fine. It depends on whether you want your creature to survive in combat when you use the trick, or if you're just trying to push in lots of damage and be completely aggro. These sorts of effects, these giant growth type effects, kind of do end games every now and then, so you can't take them completely lightly, but you'll almost never see me playing more than one of these, if one at all. Playable, but not excited. Speaking of which, we get this 5-drop Cinder Helion. It's a 4/4 for 5, which is fine. It has trample, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to target opponent. So you're shocking your opponent on top of a 4/4 trampler. This seems okay. I'm not super excited about it. I don't think it's busted. I think it's fine as a red common that would fit in most decks. The problem with Battle for Zendikar in red is that outside of the obvious devoid cards, a lot of the 4-drops and 5-drops were just very clunky. I'm thinking of the 4-drop Minotaur, the 4/4 Menace for 5, and the Belligerent Whiptail. Cards like that were just super clunky, not fantastic. This kind of fits in the same category, but at least you're getting almost guaranteed value off of it in that 2 damage, and then it leaves behind a fairly sizable body, and trample means that it's not just going to be chumped without doing some harm. So I think this card's fine. It looks a little out of place. It just doesn't seem like it's very synergistic with anything, but I think it's fine, and I would be okay playing one of these if I needed kind of a curve topper for my red deck. Alright, we get Spark Mage's Gambit here. This is 2 mana for a sorcery. Notice it is a sorcery, not an instant. This is the type of card where you just kind of assume that it's an instant because of what it does. But it deals 1 damage of up to 2 different creatures, and if it hits creatures, they can't block this turn. So a couple things. Besides this being a sorcery, it can't target players, so it has to hit creatures. There can be 1 creature on the battlefield, and this can still hit it. This isn't amazing. I think the more relevant clause is the 2 creatures can't block. That sort of effect can be devastating if you're playing against a red deck and suddenly the 2 creatures you were leaving back can't block and your opponent pushes in for the final swing. So we see this sort of effect pretty often, and it's enough to end games sometimes while not being a very powerful card. At the same time, there are a lot of X1s in the format, or at least it looks like there's going to be, as well as Eldrazi Scions, which are just 1/1. So at the very least, this is going to have some sort of utility in killing off Eldrazi Scions in most decks, if nothing else. I think if you want to play this card, you want to be very, very aggressive, and you want to push in damage so you can lock down blockers. I won't be taking this very highly, and I can't imagine a deck that really, really wants it, but I can see wanting it if I'm just trying to go for the win very early on. Alright, Zada's Commando. So this is kind of interesting because I think this card is good, but I don't really care about the cohort ability. This is a 2/1 first strike for 2, which is a very fine body. It's going to get in some damage early unless your opponent plays something on curve that just happens to block it pretty well. But if you play this on turn 2 and you're on the play, it's almost certain to get in the next turn because first strike just kind of lets you get there. It does become a little bit irrelevant later in the game when creatures start getting bigger and bigger, but early this should push in a good bit of damage. I think the cohort is there so that when it does become a little bit weaker later in the game, it still has a relevant ability, but you're tapping 2 creatures to deal 1 damage to an opponent. This can't even hit a creature. If this could hit a creature, I'd be a little more excited because it could pick off like Scions and things like that, but this can only deal 1 damage to an opponent at the cost of tapping 2 creatures. This seems really bad, actually. Think about Nettle Drone, which just taps to deal 1 and can do that multiple times per turn, depending on what you're casting. This is 1-time effect per turn, and it requires you to tap 2 of your creatures down. I'm not excited about this ability, but I think the card itself is playable and will slot into most aggressive decks just fine. Alright, Expedite. This is a very unassuming looking card. It's 1 red for instant that gives a creature haste and then you draw a card. So it replaces itself for 1 mana, and these cards are usually pretty playable. Some people like to play this type of effect as a 41st card in their deck because if you draw it, you're almost immediately replacing it with another card. So it's never really a dead card, and it kind of doesn't really affect your deck too much. Now, what this does do that is exciting is it enables Surge very easily. I guess the ideal circumstance is that you cast a creature during the same turn you play Expedite on that creature so it has haste, and then you follow up with a Surge card. That's kind of a mid-range to late-game play. A lot of times you're just going to use Expedite on a creature that can already attack just so that you can enable Surge. So if your Surge cost is at least 2 less than the casting cost of the Surge card, then Expedite kind of justifies itself by making the next card you play a little bit cheaper, which we'll see in just a second. And the fact that this draws a card means that I'm actually happy playing this. If you are getting value off the haste, then congratulations, but really you only want to play this if you're trying to make the next card you cast cheaper. Just paying 1 mana to give something haste is not fantastic by any means, but the fact that it draws a card means that it's definitely playable. And this is a great example to follow up with Expedite. This Goblin Freerunner is a 4-mana 3/2 with Menace, but it has Surge for 2, so that means if you've already cast a spell this turn, you can cast this guy for 2. Notice that Surge works fantastically with Two-Headed Giant. It's almost insane in Two-Headed Giant because you can cast a card for a Surge cost if your not your opponent, if your teammate has already cast a card this turn. So you have to sequence your cards correctly, where if you have this in your hand and you want to pay 2 for it, your opponent can cast their spell first, then you can cast this. Obviously, that's Two-Headed Giant, so most of the time you're going to be looking at this in a 1v1 environment. For 4 mana, this card is kind of passable. It's not amazing. We saw this same kind of card in Boggart Brute in, I believe, Origins. Was it 3/2 Menace for 3? And that's kind of a pretty good card. If you can cast this for 2, it's incredibly good. It's very strong, and this is why I have to talk about Bonesaw so much, because Bonesaw, being a 0-mana artifact, lets you cast your cards for Surge without actually spending mana before that. So the presence of Bone Cell in the format means that you can play something like this on turn 2. Cards like Expedite are going to let you get it out quicker too. For 3 mana, if there's a creature on the field, you can play Expedite, replace Expedite with a card, and then have 2 mana left over to play Goblin Freerunner. That's a very good turn in my opinion. But this card is, if you're just playing it as a 4 mana 3/2, I would pass on it because that's not great, and the Menace is decent, but not really for 4 mana. It's just kind of a little bit behind there. If you are 9 times out of 10 going to cast it for its Surge cost, or I would say more than half the time you plan on casting it for its Surge cost, and you can do that reliably, then this is actually an extremely good card, especially for a common. Also worth noting, it is an ally, and that is relevant. Also, Goblin is kind of a relevant creature type because of the equipment we saw that gives +1/+1 for each creature that shares creature type with it. But yeah, if you're casting this for Surge, this is a fantastic common. Following up with another Surge card, so we kind of get to see how these work. This is 5 mana, and the base is 5 mana sorcery, deal 4 to target creature. This can't hit a player. In my opinion, that's just kind of bad. Sure, it's removal, but 5 mana for inefficient removal that's not going to deal with the things that you really want to deal with when you're casting a 5 mana spell are passable. Now, this has Surge for 2. That's a significant discount, 3 less than what you're paying on the normal card. If you can cast this for 2 and deal 4 damage to a creature, then by all means, destroy that creature. This is very good in Limited for the Surge cost. It's very bad in Limited for the normal cost. So you want to be able to cast this every single time for its Surge cost, which shouldn't be too hard. I can imagine something like turn 4, play a 2-drop creature, and then follow up with this, kill your opponent's creature. So I would not bog your deck down with these, just because of how expensive it is if you're not Surging it. But if you can reliably do the Surge, then yeah, a couple of these in your deck would be quite good. Alright, we get a Devoid card here, Eldrazi Aggressor. This is a 3 mana 2/3 that has haste as long as you control another colorless creature. This is a 3 mana, so the 3 mana gets a little clunky in this sort of deck. Think Nettle Drone, Vile Aggregate, so on and so forth, Sky Spawner, Ruination Guy. Just a bunch of 3-drops that fit into the same kind of deck. Red-Blue was a very, very good deck, and this seems like just the kind of follow-up for something like Kozilek Sentinel. If you can get a colorless creature on the battlefield before turn 3 and follow up with this, it's fine. It doesn't do anything amazing since it is just a 2-power creature, but it's efficient enough, and it's not going to get chumped too easily. It might trade for something like a 3/1 or a 3/2, but I think it's fine. I don't want too many of them just because if you play a vanilla 2/3 for 3, that's not very exciting, but it shouldn't be too hard to get a colorless creature on the battlefield before you play this and sneak in a little bit of damage with this guy. Alright, Consuming Sinkhole, 4 mana land destruction, because we don't have enough of that, right? Alright, so we get a Devoid. This is an instant, and it lets you pick one, not both. So you can exile target land creature. So this is only going to hit a creature that's animated, either with Awaken or some of the spells that put counters on a creature, or if your opponent has something like Wandering Fumarole or Hiss and Quagmire, and they go to activate it and it becomes a creature for the turn, you can use it to exile it. That's a little bit worse than just exile on target land. Sure, this exiles instead of destroying, but if you're using this as land destruction, it's actually a little bit worse than Volcanic Upheaval, which is instant destroy target land. This only hits land creatures, whereas Volcanic Upheaval is going to hit any land, whether it's a creature or not. And Volcanic Upheaval, we know, is not a very playable card outside of a sideboard tech anyway. This has another ability on it to keep it from being completely dead in certain matchups, and that's deal 4 damage to target player. Again, this is kind of the opposite of the Salvo card we just saw, in that this can't hit creatures, it can only hit players. 4 mana to deal 4 damage is not really that great. Think about Lava Axe, which is 5 mana for 5 damage, and that's not really that great either. I think you want your burn to be a little bit more than what you're paying for it to be efficient enough. But sure, 4 damage can sometimes end the game, and play it by all means. This does 2 very different things, but I think it's sideboard material for land creature decks. I don't really want to run a 4 damage spell for 4 mana. Alright, and then we get Reality Hemorrhage. It's kind of a weird concept of a card, but it's basically a shock for 2 mana. has Devoid, so I don't know why Devoid makes something cost 1 more, apparently, or Shock was just too efficient. Reality Hemorrhage deals 2 damage to creature or player, so sure, kill off something early, finish off a bigger creature, deal 2 to a player, something like that. There's not very many things that care about you dealing damage through spells, but this is efficient enough that I would be able to play 1 or 2 without being too disappointed, but not good enough that I would want to jam every single one of them that I pull into my deck, just because it starts to kind of fall off once the game gets going and people start playing bigger things. Alright, and I believe the final comment here is Maul of Kozilek. This is 4 mana for a 2/5. So these are decent stats. Big blocker that we don't normally get for red. It is a Devoid card, which we've seen is relevant more in red than it is in other colors. And then it has the ability that for colorless mana, Maul of Kozilek gets +2/-2 until the end of turn. So you can trigger this up to twice without the Kozilek, without the Maul dying. The first trigger is going to make this a 4/3, which is a very aggressive creature for 4 mana. And the second trigger is going to make it a 6/1, so if you're on an unattested board, this beats down very, very fast. 6 damage is quite a bit. This is the type of thing that if you have the mana available to use the ability, your opponent's going to have to throw something in front of it, and this might even trade for that. It'll trade for a relevant creature at 4 power, or if they decide not to block and they don't have any tricks, bam, 6 damage on turn 5. That's quite good. You do have to have the colorless sources there, but as we've seen with some other ones, that's not very hard to pull off in this set, or at least I don't think it's going to be. Alright, moving into the uncommons, and we've got a great one here. I should stop before I mention that, before I talk about this card, and mention that Landfall's not really back as a full mechanic in Oath of the Gatewatch. There are a lot of things that are pseudo-Landfall and pseudo-Awaken. This is kind of the two mixed into one, but there are only, I think, 2 creatures that have Landfall and Oath of the Awaken, and they kind of do similar things. This is the first one in red. We'll see the other one in green. But Embodiment of Fury is a 4/3 Trampler, already pretty decent, justified for its mana cost. It gives your land creatures trample, whether those are lands that have been animated through an effect like this one, or lands that just animate themselves, like Needle Spires, Hiss and Quagmire, stuff like that. This one says, whenever your land is just about under your control, you can choose a land you control, make it a 3/3 for the turn with haste. So yeah, very strong. Sometimes you get to play this and then a land in the same turn, and you've just added 7 damage. The land that you choose for this ability is only a creature for the turn, unlike most abilities which put counters on it and make it permanently a creature. So it's kind of a way to dodge sorcery speed. The fact that your land creatures have trample won't be relevant too often, just because they're 3/3s, and if they're going to get blocked by something, they're usually going to trade. They're not going to get chumped very often. But this is very, very powerful, first pickable material in my opinion, and leads to some very synergistic things. There are a lot of abilities that turn your lands into creatures, and just having something like this available is great. It also helps with flooding later of the game. If you have this on the board and you're just drawing lands, you're drawing 3/3 hastes every time, and that can be relevant in certain board positions. So yeah, I'm very happy about this. I'm happy about the other one too, which we'll see in the green video, but yeah, how excited are you for this? Seems pretty good in my opinion. Alright, Pyromancer's Assault, 4 mana for an enchantment. This is kind of a build-around uncommon. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, Pyromancer's Assault deals 2 damage to target creature or player. Now, this can trigger on your turn and your opponent's turn, so if it's the second spell that you've cast in your turn or your opponent's turn, it shocks something. So you can trigger it technically twice per turn cycle. Also, this hits creature or player, so it's pretty versatile, and it only counts for the second spell, so don't fall into thinking that it's every sequential spell you cast after the first one. It's only the second spell each turn, so the third doesn't trigger this. But yeah, this seems great, actually, in the right sort of deck. Obviously, this is what you want to be playing alongside Surge decks, I think. I think that's the intended purpose here, and outside of that, it's actually very close to unplayable. If you have a high curve or a pretty typical deck that does one thing per turn until the late game, this doesn't seem amazing. If you have a very low curve and this is kind of your topper, the payoff's definitely there. I can see this being passed a lot. It seems like it's going to spawn its own kind of deck, like the blue-red Surge deck with Pyromancer's Assault. But I'm sure I'll see this. This seems like the type of card people would really enjoy drafting, and it's unique enough that it's not really replaceable. Effects that have repeated sources of damage are usually pretty good, and this is a decent one, although I think it's more of a middle-end type effect than it is a great one. So draft it at your own will. Let me know how it works for you, and let me know what your opinion on this card is. Alright, following up with another Surge card. At the base, we've got a 3-mana 2/1, which is with haste. That makes it a little bit better. And it has Surge for 2. So again, if you see Surge on a card, you want to be casting it for Surge just because it's a discount on what you're playing. But the card is fine as a base 2/1 haste for 3. Not exciting. When it enters the battlefield, if its Surge cost was paid, other creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. So the ideal situation is you want to play a creature before this and follow up with Surge in this. The ability only triggers on Surgeons, so if you just play it for 3 mana, you are not getting the +1/0 on the other creatures and haste. Again, we have an ally and a goblin, but this fits into extremely aggressive strategies. I feel like the format's going to be a lot quicker than triple battle just because of the presence of cards like this. Thankfully, it's uncommon, so you're not going to see it back to back to back, and if you do, you're probably dead. But this card's pretty good, and I think, like I said, I think it's going to make the format a little bit faster with these pretty efficient Surge cards. Mostly the Goblins, they seem pretty good. But I'm pretty excited about this one. Alright, Tears of Alka. It's 2-mana instant. Apparently when Valka cries, it only hits flyers. Everybody on the ground looks just fine here. But Tears of Alka can't be countered by spells or abilities. Okay, and it deals 5 damage to target creature with flying. Now, this is a red plummet. In almost all situations, so if Plummet is considered a sideboard card, then I consider this a sideboard card, and I definitely do. I feel like the presence of this card, Tears of Alka, is apologies, I thought it seemed like that thing stopped there, but I think we're fine to keep going. Like I was saying, Tears of Alka seems like a nod to the presence of cards like Dragonlord Ojutai in Standard and Constructed more than it is necessary for Limited. It is definitely a good sideboard option for Limited. Being able to deal with flyers is a very good option, especially in Red, which doesn't give very many flyers. But yeah, keep this in your sideboard unless you see the flyers. Don't go main decking it unless you know for a fact your opponent's on like blue-white flyers or something like that. Right, here's a pretty ugly looking card, but this is an Equipment Matters card in red. It's 3 mana for a 3/2, which we saw in the very first card, the Flame Color, I believe, the Aquam something. That's just fine of a mana cost to power and toughness ratio. Pretty interesting effect here for 0 mana. In other words, you can trigger this at sorcery speed without paying mana or tapping. You can choose an equipment you have and attach it to this thing for free. So I claimed in my white video that the equipment deck is going to be the deck that does not get there, and this makes it very tempting. This is unique. If you have very strong equipment on the field, for instance, ones like the chitinous cloak that give a pretty hefty power and toughness, this seems like an incentive to play it. But I think this falls more into the trap of the Relic Seeker thing that I talked about, where it's tempting to play bad equipment in your deck because you have something like this. My opinion is if you have good equipment, run that good equipment, but don't play bad equipment in your deck for this. Do not play Slab Hammer because you have this card in your deck. Slab Hammer is still not good anytime ever. Except for the times when it is good, but that's very rarely. Thankfully, at its base, this is a 3/2 for 3, and that's just fine. So the ability could be decent at some times, but I'm not definitely not forcing an archetype for it. And if we go in the correct direction, we get the Threaten. I feel like Wizards is not allowed to publish a set unless there's some sort of Threaten effect in it. This one being 5 mana, so it's in the same range as Turn Against. This lets you basically support 2, then take a creature for the turn. You get all the shenanigans with untap, gain haste, so on and so forth. One thing interesting that this does do is you can, with like all threat effects, you can usually target your own creature to give it haste for the turn, and this lets you do that with a 1/1 counter on that creature. more often you're going to take your opponent's creature while also pumping up. You want to use this as a win condition. Really, I don't like to run threaten effects unless they're instant speed in my deck. I do like turn against more than most people, but something like this, you really want to be using it to win the game. It just, for 5 mana, you don't want to just take a creature and then pass it back and then the board stays the same. You want to push in a lot of damage. And this is basically, in the right situation, a shock on top of the damage you're going to be doing in combat. So this will end games sometimes, and that's probably why it's an uncommon instead of a common. Adding 2 extra power to the damage you're going to do is usually enough. Think about all the times you've drafted something like active aggression or active treason, and you've taken your opponent's creature, and you just need a little bit more damage. Well, this is what it does, assuming that you're also attacking with your own creatures. If you have a nice sacrifice type effect, obviously these things get a little bit better because you can take your opponent's creature and they won't get it back, but take 1 or 2 of these if you're really trying to end the game and you're in need of a finisher, because this can kind of fill the role of it in certain situations. Alright, follow up with the Valor and Flame, another sorcery speed card. This one costs 3 mana. It has the additional cast that you have to return a land you control to your hand. Now, that first part lets you kind of reuse landfall triggers, which is pretty neat in this sort of effect. Having an ability that lets you use it means that sometimes this is less of a downside and more of an upside. Of course, you want to be in a certain type of deck for that to matter. Otherwise, this is just going to set you back a land. But it does deal 5 damage to a creature, or, in the off chance, a planeswalker, which is always nice to have. This is decent removal. This is pretty good. It deals with something. It's going to deal with almost everything. The 5 damage is not irrelevant. And like I said, if you're in like red-green landfall or something like that, then first off, I'm sorry that happened to you. Second off, do the 5 damage and let it be pretty good. I'm mostly ignoring the fact that this hits planeswalkers, but sometimes that's relevant, and it's a nice little addition to have. Right, Immobilizer Eldrazi. This is what I like to call a calculator card. That's just kind of my pet name for it. But we get a 2 mana devoid creature that has an activated cost for 3, one of which has to be colorless, saying each creature with toughness greater than its power can't block this turn. So the creatures that have more power than toughness can't block. So this is a type of card where you have to look on the battlefield and kind of take into consideration all the boosts and what kind of power and toughness spread everything has, because it will affect certain creatures and won't affect other ones. This also seems like a pretty decent card in Two-Headed Giant, but just because it's a widespread effect, it doesn't target a player, doesn't target a particular creature. If you and your partner are trying to just get in there very quickly, this could do the job. Also, there's sometimes that this ability is just dead because your opponent has all creatures with a lower toughness lower than their power, and that makes it unfortunate. But if you're looking for kind of an aggressive mold, or you need the void creatures on curve, this fills the slot nicely, and I don't think it's that bad. Alright, moving into the rares, Tyrant of Alka. Just like threaten effects, you cannot get through a set without having some bulky, huge flying dragon in mono red. But this one looks pretty intriguing. So on the base, you've got 7 mana for a 5/4. When it enters the battlefield, obviously flying. When it enters the battlefield, if its surge cost was paid, it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. Surge cost in 5. Now that is where you want to be for this card. 7 for a 5/4 flyer is not great. Actually, it's kind of really weak. And it is significant that the Enter the Battlefield trigger only triggers if you cast Surge. So if you cast this for the full 7, you're not getting that extra little bit out of it. Obviously, there's a difference of 2 mana between casting this and surging it, so you really want to ideally have something like a 2 mana card before you cast this. Still playing it on turn 7. But again, the presence of cards like Bonesaw lets you play this on curve as 5, and cards like Expedite are going to let you get it on turn 6. If you cast this for Surge, you're getting a 5/4 flyer, 4/5, which is great, in addition to a bolt to target creature or player. So a removal spell on top of a very well-costed flyer makes this card great if you're in red. And if you have a low enough curve to trigger that Surge, I think it's a fantastic card. A little bit better than most of the dragons I'm used to seeing, and I'd be very happy pulling this if I were in red. Alright, second card out of our cycle of Oaths. This is 2 mana for a legendary enchantment that enters the battlefield and basically lightning bolt. It's 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. It does not hit a player, so you can't just wrap up the game and call it a day with this, but it does deal enough damage that I think it justifies itself. Again, for the purposes of limited, we're kind of ignoring the Planeswalker clause, but if for some reason you happen to play a Planeswalker, this will do 2 damage to your opponent at the end of turn. Fantastic. That's even really not that great, because how many Planeswalkers are you playing? I guess if you can get 2 damage out of the one Planeswalker you might play with this, then sure, go ahead. But you're really looking at the first ability. 2 mana for 3 damage at sorcery speed is just fine, and I think this is a little bit more playable than Gideon's Oath, which, to be honest, isn't that bad, but is just unexciting outside of the constructed format. Alright, Fall of the Titans. Apparently Chandra's just really good at dealing with things. But here we have a double X cost and a red. Fall of the Titans deals X damage to each of up to 2 target creatures and or players. That means if you want to deal 1 damage to 2 different targets, you have to pay 1, 1, and red, which is going to be 3 total. 2 damage to 2 targets will cost 2, 2, and red, which will be 5 total. Now if you're surging this, if you cast a spell before this, Bonesaw, then it only costs 1x, and you still get to choose 2 targets for it. Surge is amazing on this card, absolutely great, because this is a little bit pricey. If you wanted to deal 3 damage to 2 targets, this would be a 7 mana spell, and that's kind of where you want to be. Whereas if you want to deal 3 damage to 2 targets, and you've already cast a spell that turn, this costs 4, which is a huge, huge discount. I just want to point out, this is probably one of the most busted cards in Two-Headed Giant, just because you can target 2 different players with it, each opponent, and they will both lose the life, which will come out of their total. You're basically doing double damage to your opponent. In a 1v1 game, this deals damage to 2 different creatures, or it deals damage to a creature and them. It's just versatile enough that I think it's worth picking if you're in red, and if you can surge it. In fact, you should probably hold this card until you can surge it. It's definitely way, way worth it. The extra mana you'll spend to cast double X is enough that you could cast a spell before this and then use it for the discount. Right, Goblin Darkdwellers is another card that seems very interesting. This, by the way, is the Buy a Box promo, with different art, of course. So if you're planning on trying to crack expeditions from your Buy a Box, you're going to pull one of these as your promo, which is decent, even though the art could be a little bit better, but that's my opinion. 5 mana for a 4/4 is okay. This has Menace as well, so it's got a little bit of evasion. I complained about a 5 mana 4/4 with Menace earlier. That was a common from Battle for Zendikar, but this is all upside from there. When it enters the battlefield, you can cast target instant or sorcery with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard. If you do, exile that card the turn. If you have a burn spell in your graveyard, then this comes attached to a 3 mana burn spell. Something like Touch of the Void you can cast for free when you play this. If you're in red-blue, which I think is going to be a common archetype because of Surge in this, then you get to cast things like bounce spells, which we haven't looked at blue yet, but there's a good number of efficient draw or bounce spells in this set that Goblin Darkdwellers looks very appealing. Red-black could be a good combination for this as well, as we're going to see there's quite a bit of removal in black, and this is very excited for that. So I think this is very, this is a first pickable card in draft. I think it's quite good, very efficient, and lets you get value out of things in your graveyard, which is always good. Right, the final rare before we get to the 2 mythics. This is Eldrazi Obligator. It's a 3 mana to void creature. It's a 3/1 haste as well, which is fine. If you just cast it for 3 damage out of nowhere is pretty good. What it lets you do is, if you cast it, you can pay 2, and if you do, you control target creature. It's another threaten ability tacked onto a creature. This obviously reminds us all of Zealous Conscripts, which was 5 mana haste, take control of a permanent. This only targets creatures. But in certain situations, this is very similar to the last threaten effect we saw, but it comes attached to a body of its own. This thing is going to die very easily because of the 1 toughness, but the fact that it takes another creature means if you time it correctly, you can use it for a huge chunk of damage on the opponent. Usually after they swing out and they've got you dead on board or something like that, you can take advantage of the 3 damage here plus the damage off the creature you control. Again, if you have some sort of neat sacrifice effect, you can take their creature and sack it off. Now, it's not free. You do have to pay the extra 2, so the total cost of this card is 5, but the fact that you can cast it on 3 for a 3/1 haste seems pretty good to me. Alright, moving into the 2 red mythics we have. The first one is quite a doozy. It's Kozilek's Return. Now, this is a very, very strong card in my opinion. It's 3 mana for an instant. Notice that this is an instant. When I read the effect, I assumed it was a sorcery, but it is actually instant speed. And at instant speed for 3 mana, you get to deal 2 damage to each creature. So in the right situation, this wipes the board. Against something like a white deck where all the creatures have low toughness, this does a pretty good job. But it gets a little bit better, because when you cast an Eldrazi with converted mana cost 7 or greater, you can exile this card from your graveyard, and if you do, it deals 5 damage to each creature. Now that's pretty crazy. You do have to have something big. It has to be an Eldrazi card. It can't just be any big creature, colorless creature or something like that. But if you cast a big Eldrazi, which there are tons of, think Ruin Processor is a card that fits into a lot of decks, you get to wipe the board again, 5 damage to each creature. And the fun thing about that is that the Eldrazi you cast is probably going to, well, actually, it is going to survive it, because the cast trigger, your Eldrazi will still be on the stack when Kozilek's Return resolves, meaning the 5 damage will be dealt before your Eldrazi enters the battlefield. So you get a early game board wipe, or in most situations a board wipe, followed by a late game board wipe, and then you're probably left with the big fatty on board. This does a lot for 3 mana. It's not like you have to pay mana for the second trigger. You definitely don't. It just happens when you cast that 7 or greater. Even if your opponent tries to counter your big creature, you still get the option to do this, and they cannot counter this because it is an ability, not a spell on the stack. But yeah, Kozilek's Return, taking it every single time. It's also a money rare right now, and there's speculation about how it's going to work in Modern, and I'll almost certainly see in Standard play. I would bet money on that. And the final one, I think this is a little actually less exciting than Kozilek's Return, but still pretty good. Chandra Flame is 6 mana. That's pretty expensive for a Planeswalker, so it better do a lot. It starts at 4 loyalty. And if we want to immediately start plussing it, we're getting 1 counter, and we're getting 2 3/1 haste guys till end of turn, elementals until end of turn, and you exile them at the end step. So you only get them for a little bit, but you're getting 6 damage on board with haste, and it's spread out across 2 bodies. There are sometimes you'll play Chandra, and if you use that +1, well, your opponent can just block, and it doesn't do very much, but there's sometimes you play Chandra, you're in a top deck war, something just happened and all the creatures are off the field, and you play this, and now you've got a Planeswalker that threatens to do other things while also smacking you for 6 hasty damage a turn. This can end games very, very quickly on its own, if unattested. Although the fact is, at 6 mana, there's probably going to be creatures on the board when this hits, so those 3/1s, they're probably just biting the dust, but Chandra gets to go up while doing it. It does force your opponent into blocks, otherwise they're taking a huge amount of damage. The 0 is pretty interesting. Probably the 0 is what's going to push this into Standard if it gets played at all, but it lets you discard all the cards in your hand, and then you draw the same number of cards +1. So you're up a card. If you discard 0, if you have no cards in hand, you basically draw a card. If you discard 5, you draw 6. Something like that. But that's pretty good. It is 0 to do it, so the loyalty's not going down. You can do that immediately if your hand is terrible, and you're going to always net at least 1 card. So the 0 is very interesting alternative to the other 2 abilities. And then you have a -X ability, deal X to each creature. So yeah, you could, if worst case scenario, you pay your 6 mana card, you can -4 her immediately, and then wipe the field. Although, again, same problem with the +1 as the -X is that once you get to the point where you're casting 6 mana spells like this, there are probably very likely going to be 1 or 2 creatures on the field that will not die to -4. So you have to maneuver this in such a way that you're plussing to get Chandra up higher so that the minus becomes a little bit relevant. But it's a little awkward because she doesn't really protect herself, since those elementals are gone at the end of turn. She leaves herself wide open if you don't have other creatures to protect her. So this is not by any means like the greatest creature or the greatest Planeswalker we've ever seen, but I think I'm happy to play it. If I was playing super competitively in a very, very big tournament, there are some cards that I would take over it that I've seen, but if I'm playing just casually, then I'm super excited to pull this and try and make it work out. But yeah, there you go for the red cards. I hope there wasn't any problem with the recording because something popped up in the middle, but let me know what you think of these. I think red is versatile enough here to make it work with a bunch of different things. We see that the Devoid theme is still kind of being supported a little bit, although with not as crazy creatures as like Nettle Drone and Vile Aggregate, but definitely two very powerful mythics at the top end, as well as some good rares, as well as the Surge mechanic, which is one of the most intriguing mechanics to me here. I'm not a big fan of Cohort, and Support is just kind of unexciting mechanic to me, but Surge has a lot of potential that I'm very excited for, and when we get to blue, you'll see some more of the Surge cards. I'm even more excited for the blue Surge cards than I am the red ones, but red seems more aggressive. The takeaway point here is that I think red is going to speed up the format a little bit. I think there are going to be decks that push in damage very quickly and with very efficient creatures, and I think that's going to have to be taken into consideration when you're deciding what you're going to play in your deck, whether you're playing life gain spells or big blockers as opposed to more late game cards like your big Eldrazi. But there you have it for red. We'll be back again, probably follow up with blue, as it's a good follow-up to the red, and let me know what you think of all these cards. I look forward to your comments, and I will see you guys for the next video.